He shuffled through the glass doors of Sterling Luxury Motors, wearing a faded brown coat that had seen better decades and shoes that whispered against the polished marble floor. The old man's weathered hands clutched a small notebook as he approached the gleaming row of vehicles, his eyes settling on a silver Porsche that sparkled under the showroom lights. Marcus Sterling looked up from his mahogany desk, his perfectly pressed charcoal suit and slicked back hair reflecting the kind of man who measured worth by appearances. His eyes swept over the elderly visitor with barely concealed disgust. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with condescension as he strode across the showroom. "I think you might be lost. The bus station is 3 blocks down." The old man turned slowly, his calm blue eyes meeting Marcus's smirk. "I was hoping to look at that Porsche," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that gentle words often spoke louder than shouting. Marcus laughed, a sharp cutting sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Look, Grandpa, these cars start at 200,000. Maybe try the used car lot on 5th Street? He gestured dismissively toward the exit, loud enough for the well-dressed couple near the BMW display to turn and stare. Heat crept up the old man's neck as other customers began to notice the commotion. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband, both watching the scene unfold with uncomfortable fascination. But something flickered in the old man's eyes. Not anger, but a quiet certainty that tomorrow would bring something none of them could imagine. Something that would shake the very foundations of what they thought they knew about worth. What Marcus Sterling couldn't see beneath that worn brown coat was a man whose gentle hands had built something extraordinary from nothing. Harold Benjamin Morrison, when his name was spoken in full for the first time in decades outside his closest circle, was the founder and driving force behind the Morrison Foundation for Financial Literacy, an organization that had transformed over 500,000 lives long before he'd met his beloved wife, Eleanor. He'd built the foundation from the ground up, dedicating his background in accounting and his passion for economic justice to create real change. The foundation didn't just teach budgeting, it rebuilt entire family legacies. Take Maria Santos, a single mother from the Bronx, who'd come to Harold's first workshop in 1987, drowning in credit card debt. Today, she owns 3 small businesses and has sent all 4 of her children to college. Harold still received Christmas cards from her grandchildren, but the world around him remained blind to this quiet giant who preferred subway rides to limousines and corner diners to 5-star restaurants. Harold had learned long ago that true power whispered while insecurity shouted. His worn leather wallet contained credit cards that could purchase the entire Sterling dealership, yet he carried coupons for the local grocery store where he'd shopped for 30 years. Eleanor often teased him about his stubborn humility. "Harold," she'd say while mending the same brown coat he'd worn to their first date in 1978, "you dress like you're still that young accountant afraid to ask for a raise." But Harold understood something others missed. The moment you started dressing for others' approval, you stopped dressing for your own soul. His neighbors in their modest Queens apartment building knew him as the man who shoveled Mrs. Chen's sidewalk every winter and helped Mr. Rodriguez with his taxes each April. They had no idea that their quiet neighbor had quietly funded the construction of the new community center, donating the money through a series of anonymous gifts that the local newspaper had dubbed the Queen's Angel. Harold's investment portfolio read like a Fortune 500 directory, but he'd learned to hide his success after watching money destroy too many relationships. He'd seen childhood friends turn bitter when they discovered his wealth, suddenly viewing decades of genuine friendship through the lens of what they could gain. So he'd chosen invisibility, letting the world see only what they expected. An aging man, in comfortable clothes, living a simple life. What Marcus Sterling had dismissed as worthlessness was actually the quiet confidence of someone who'd never needed to prove anything to anyone. Harold had stopped seeking external validation the day he'd realized that the homeless veteran he'd been helping find housing was the same man who'd saved his unit in Vietnam 40 years earlier. Sometimes the universe had a way of reminding you that every person carried invisible worth. Even now, walking slowly past the gleaming cars he could purchase without checking his bank balance, Harold felt no anger toward the young man who'd humiliated him. Marcus was trapped in a prison of his own making, measuring his worth by the shine on his shoes and the thickness of his wallet. Harold had escaped that prison decades ago. The shift began with something so small that Marcus almost missed it entirely. 3 days after the humiliation at Sterling Motors, Harold was reading his morning paper at Rosie's Diner when a young woman approached his table, tears streaming down her face. "Are you Mr. Morrison?" she whispered, clutching a business card that had been folded and unfolded countless times. The man from the foundation. Harold looked up from his coffee, recognizing Sarah Mitchell, one of the financial literacy workshop graduates from 2 years prior. She'd been a struggling nursing student then, working 3 jobs to stay afloat. Now she stood before him in scrubs, her face glowing with something that made Harold's chest tighten with pride. "I just bought my first house," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A real house, Mr. Morrison, for me and my daughter, because of what you taught me about credit repair and savings." She pressed something into his weathered palm, a small photo of a little girl standing in front of a yellow front door, grinning with missing teeth. Harold studied the photo, his eyes misting. These moments, these quiet victories, were worth more than any luxury car or marble showroom. "You did this, Sarah. I just showed you the path." But Sarah shook her head firmly. "You gave me back my future when everyone else said I was too far gone." She glanced around the humble diner, then back at Harold's simple clothes. "I know you don't want recognition, but I need you to know you're changing the world one person at a time." What Harold didn't realize was that Marcus Sterling had been having coffee at the counter, close enough to overhear every word. The arrogant salesman's hand had frozen halfway to his mouth as he'd listened to Sarah describe Harold as the most important man in Queens. Marcus had dismissed it as confusion. Surely this old man in the patched coat couldn't be anyone significant. Later that same week, Harold was leaving the public library when he noticed a commotion near the community center. A local news crew was interviewing residents about the mysterious benefactor who'd funded the building's renovation. Harold paused behind a tree, listening as Mr. Rodriguez told the reporter about an angel in our neighborhood who never asks for credit. "Whoever this person is," Mr. Rodriguez continued, his eyes bright with emotion, "they understand what real community means. They could have put their name on the building, but they chose to let the children's artwork shine instead." Harold smiled to himself, remembering the day he'd insisted that the donation be completely anonymous. He'd watched from across the street as the children had painted a mural on the new walls, stick figures holding hands around a rainbow that seemed to embrace the entire neighborhood. The seeds of change were sprouting in unexpected places. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the hospital administrator who'd once been skeptical of Harold's financial literacy program, was now referring patients to the foundation after seeing how medical debt counseling had transformed recovery rates. She'd started telling colleagues about this remarkable program run by the most humble man you'll ever meet. Even Marcus Sterling's own dealership was feeling ripples Harold had created. 3 of their former customers had paid off their car loans early after attending Morrison Foundation workshops, surprising the finance department with their sudden financial discipline. The sales manager had begun asking where these customers were learning such effective money management skills. Harold remained unaware that his quiet influence was creating a web of connection that stretched far beyond his modest apartment. Eleanor noticed it, though, the way strangers sometimes recognized Harold on the street, approaching with grateful smiles and whispered thanks. She watched her husband's gentle deflection of praise, his innate ability to redirect credit back to the people who'd done the actual work of changing their lives. But change was accelerating, and Harold's carefully maintained anonymity was developing cracks. A financial journalist had begun investigating the Morrison effect, a term economists were using to describe the unusual pattern of debt reduction and wealth building appearing in certain New York neighborhoods. The reporter was getting close to connecting the dots. Tomorrow would bring a choice Harold hadn't anticipated, a moment when his 2 worlds would collide in the most public way possible. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, but Harold Morrison woke with unusual purpose. Eleanor found him standing in their modest garage, running his weathered hand along the pristine curves of a 1987 Bentley Turbo R that hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. "Harold," Eleanor's voice carried the soft concern of a woman who'd learned to read her husband's quiet storms. "What are you thinking?" He turned to her, his blue eyes holding something she hadn't seen in decades. Not anger, but a crystalline clarity that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this gentle giant. "I'm thinking it's time to do something good with this old thing." The Bentley purred to life like a sleeping lion awakening. Harold had maintained it meticulously over the years, not out of vanity, but because his father had taught him that you care for what you're blessed to possess. As he drove through Queens toward Manhattan, Harold wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking opportunity. Sterling Luxury Motors came into view at exactly 10:47 a.m. Harold parked the vintage Bentley directly in front of the showroom windows, its silver magnificence creating an immediate stir among the staff inside. Marcus Sterling dropped his coffee cup when he recognized the old man stepping out of what was clearly a $250,000 classic. Harold walked through those same glass doors wearing the identical brown coat, but this time, something had shifted in the cosmic balance. Marcus approached hesitantly, his previous arrogance cracking like thin ice. "Sir, that's quite a beautiful vehicle you're driving," Marcus stammered, his voice stripped of yesterday's condescension. Harold nodded politely. "Thank you. I'm here to make a purchase if you have time." Before Marcus could respond, Harold reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a handwritten list. "I need 12 vehicles. Mixed selection, luxury sedans, SUVs, a few sports cars, cash purchase, for a charity auction." The showroom fell silent. Even the couple who'd witnessed yesterday's humiliation stopped their conversation to stare. Marcus's hands trembled as he accepted the list, his eyes scanning figures that totaled nearly $3 million. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Let me get our manager." Marcus's voice trailed off as recognition finally dawned. The homeless-looking man he'd dismissed was making the largest single purchase in Sterling Motors history. But Harold raised a gentle hand. "Actually, I'd prefer to work with you if that's acceptable." What happened next would be recounted in financial circles for years to come. As Harold calmly discussed specifications and delivery arrangements, Marcus's phone began buzzing incessantly. A Wall Street Journal reporter had somehow gotten wind of the transaction and was desperately trying to confirm rumors about H.B. Morrison's unexpected public appearance. The reporter burst through the dealership doors just as Harold was signing the final paperwork. "Mr. Morrison, Rebecca Chen, Wall Street Journal. Can you confirm that you're purchasing these vehicles for the Morrison Foundation?" The entire showroom froze. Marcus Sterling felt the blood drain from his face as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just any wealthy eccentric. This was the legendary H.B. Morrison, the mysterious founder of one of America's most effective financial literacy organizations, the silent investor, whose early backing had helped launch companies now worth billions. Harold looked up from the contract, his calm eyes meeting the reporter's eager gaze. "I'm purchasing vehicles for a charity auction, yes. The proceeds will support financial education programs. But Mr. Morrison," Rebecca pressed, "this is your first major public transaction in over a decade. Why now? Why here?" Harold glanced at Marcus, who stood frozen behind the desk, still processing the magnitude of his previous day's mistake. "Sometimes," Harold said quietly, "the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, to do exactly what needs doing." The reporter's eyes gleamed as she scribbled notes. "Sir, our research shows your investment portfolio includes early stakes in 7 companies that went public in the last 5 years. Conservative estimates put your net worth above what matters," Harold interrupted gently. "Numbers on paper don't feed families or teach children about financial responsibility." And that's when everyone in the showroom, Marcus included, finally understood. They weren't witnessing a rich man's revenge. They were watching something far more powerful: dignity in action. Before we continue to the next part, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Marcus Sterling realized he was standing in the presence of someone who measured wealth not in dollars, but in lives transformed. The question was, what would he do with this revelation? The silence in Sterling Luxury Motors stretched like a held breath. Marcus Sterling stood behind his mahogany desk, watching Harold Morrison sign papers worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime, and felt something crumble inside his chest. Not his pride, but the brittle shell he'd built around his heart. Rebecca Chen's camera crew had arrived, transforming the showroom into an impromptu news studio. Other customers gathered at respectful distances, their whispered conversations creating a backdrop of awe and disbelief. But Harold remained focused on the task at hand, treating the extraordinary moment with the same quiet attention he'd give to helping a neighbor with their taxes. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca continued, her voice softer now, "can you tell us about the foundation? Our research suggests you've helped over 500,000 people escape debt cycles." Harold paused his signing, looking up with those patient blue eyes that had seen too much suffering to waste time on self-promotion. "The foundation exists because everyone deserves a chance to understand money before money controls them." He gestured toward Marcus, who flinched at the unexpected attention. "This young man works hard. He understands value. He just needed reminding that it comes in forms you can't always see. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Harold wasn't exposing him, wasn't demanding apologies or groveling. Instead, this man he'd humiliated was somehow offering him grace he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. "Sir," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's, "I owe you an apology. Yesterday I was completely wrong." Harold stood slowly, his weathered hands smoothing the contract. "Marcus, isn't it?" When the younger man nodded, Harold continued, "Tell me about your family." The unexpected question caught Marcus off guard. My family? Do you have children? Parents who worry about you?" Marcus's carefully constructed facade began dissolving. "My mum. She raised me alone after Dad left. Works double shifts at a diner in Brooklyn." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She's proud I wear a suit to work. Says I made it further than anyone in our family ever has." Harold nodded with understanding that seemed to reach across decades. "And you have. But success isn't measured by the people you look down on. It's measured by how many you lift up." Rebecca Chen watched this exchange with growing fascination, recognizing that she was witnessing something far more valuable than a financial transaction. Here was a masterclass in human dignity, taught by a man whose greatest wealth was his character. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared in the showroom doorway, having heard about Harold's location through the Foundation's network. Behind her came Sarah Mitchell, still in her nursing scrubs, clutching her daughter's hand. Word was spreading through the community Harold had quietly served for decades. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Walsh called out, "we heard you were here. We wanted to thank you properly." More people began arriving. Mr. Rodriguez with tears in his eyes, Mrs. Chen carrying a plate of homemade cookies, young entrepreneurs whose businesses Harold had quietly funded in their earliest days. The luxury showroom filled with ordinary people whose lives had been touched by extraordinary kindness. Marcus watched this impromptu gathering with growing wonder. These weren't wealthy clients impressed by expensive cars. These were grateful human beings, celebrating someone who'd seen their potential when others had seen only problems. 30 years, Harold said softly to Marcus. "I've been learning that real wealth multiplies when you give it away. These people," he gestured toward the growing crowd, "they're not here for my money. They're here because someone believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves." Eleanor Morrison appeared in the crowd, her eyes finding Harold's with the shared understanding of a lifetime partnership. She approached Marcus with the gentle authority of a retired teacher. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying decades of classroom wisdom, "my husband sees something in everyone that they can't always see in themselves. The question is, what are you going to do with what he's shown you today?" Marcus looked around the showroom, at the reporter documenting this unprecedented display of community gratitude, at the luxury cars that suddenly seemed less important than the connections between people, at Harold Morrison who stood at the center of it all like a quiet lighthouse in a storm of his own goodness. For the first time in years, Marcus Sterling understood what true success looked like, and he knew his life would never be the same. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the camera crew packed their equipment, Harold Morrison stood quietly in the Sterling showroom, watching Eleanor help Mrs. Chen distribute cookies to anyone within reach. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor where yesterday's humiliation had transformed into today's revelation. Marcus Sterling approached Harold one final time, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there that morning. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something." He paused, struggling with words that felt too small for what he needed to express. "Why didn't you tell me who you were yesterday? You could have ended my career with a single phone call." Harold turned from watching his wife's gentle interactions, his blue eyes holding the patience of someone who'd learned that the most important lessons often came wrapped in the most difficult moments. "Marcus, if I'd told you my name, you would have treated me differently. Not because you'd grown as a person, but because you'd been afraid of consequences." Harold's voice carried the gentle authority of a grandfather sharing hard-won wisdom. "Real change doesn't come from fear. It comes from understanding that every person who walks through those doors carries a story you haven't heard yet." The young salesman nodded slowly, his mind processing implications that stretched far beyond luxury car sales. "But how do you know? How do you see past appearances when everyone else just judges?" Harold smiled, the kind of expression that seemed to embrace decades of experience. "I learned it from a homeless veteran who saved my life in Vietnam, then disappeared for 40 years before I found him again living under a bridge in Queens. The man I thought was a hero had become invisible to everyone else. That taught me that worth isn't something you wear, it's something you carry. Eleanor joined them, slipping her hand into Harold's with the easy comfort of a partnership that had weathered every season. "The real question, dear," she said to Marcus, "is what kind of person do you want to be tomorrow?" Marcus looked around the showroom that would never feel the same again, at the space where his assumptions had been gently but thoroughly dismantled by a man in a worn brown coat who commanded more respect than any amount of expensive clothing ever could. "I want to be someone who sees people the way you do, Mr. Morrison. I want to matter the way you matter." Harold extended his weathered hand, and Marcus grasped it with something approaching reverence. "Then start tomorrow by remembering that everyone who walks through those doors is someone's child, someone's hope, someone's second chance. Treat them accordingly." As Harold and Eleanor walked toward the vintage Bentley, Marcus called out one last question. "Mr. Morrison, how will I know if I'm doing it right?" Harold paused at the driver's door, his gentle smile containing multitudes. "You'll know because the person looking back at you in the mirror will be someone you're proud to be." The silver Bentley pulled away slowly, leaving behind a transformed showroom and a young man whose understanding of wealth had been forever changed by an encounter with true richness of spirit. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from punishment, but from witnessing what genuine grace looks like in action. You won't believe what happened when another simple man walked into a five-star restaurant wearing work clothes. This story will leave you speechless.